And going back into the problems of the Philadelphia experiment, when Duncan and I jumped overboard off the ship, the Eldridge, in hyperspace, we of course didn't know what was happening and where we were going, or if we were going anywhere except, of course, into the water. We expected to hit the water in the bay and swim ashore, but no water. We never hit it. We kept falling and falling for quite a period of time. And then it seemed to level out, and we were, shall I say, flying along? That's not the right term, but it seemed like we were, through cloud banks and other strange phenomena. This went on for a period of time, and then we blanked out, and we woke up, as we found out, in a hospital, Duncan in one bed and I in another in the same room, and wondering what has happened, where were we, and what was going on. Well, a hospital attendant, an orderly, came in, did the usual measurements of the usual vital signs and so forth, and I said, would you like to watch TV? He said, yes. So we turned on the TV. At this point, we didn't know that anything was wrong or anything was any different than the era we had come from. Except, of course, in 1943, we didn't have large-screen color TV. This happened to be a wall-mounted unit, smaller size but color, which was the first discrepancy. We watched the TV. We were actually in that hospital for 4 weeks recovering. We finally asked what we were doing here. They wouldn't tell us how we got there, but they said you have suffered severe radiation burns. I said, radiation from what? And they sort of demurred on giving us a straight answer. And they said, no, it's not nuclear radiation. As it turns out, we learned much later, of course, there was radiation that you will possibly run into in deep space under certain other conditions, which, of course, is non-nuclear, but nevertheless, it's an ionizing form of radiation that can be damaging to the body. So it took about 4 weeks to recover, but in that process, in that time, we watched a lot of television. At that point, I would say after a week of watching TV, I started asking a lot of questions. Because it was quite obvious that things were not normal. Normal in the sense of how we knew them in 1943, that the indications were there were very few cities around the country anymore. There were boundaries for reference. Like what states do we have in the U.S.? Well, boundaries referenced were in accordance with the American map as we saw it. But we were told very bluntly that no longer is there a government. Whatever is left of it is under military control. There were a number of references on television to the changed coastlines. It struck us that they were changed. They didn't say that. We started asking questions. Well, can you give us some maps of the United States? Maybe the United States and Canada. Oh, sure. No problem. They got them for us. We were rather dismayed to find that a good chunk of California had disappeared, was no longer above water, was obviously underwater. The Pacific Ocean was now encroaching on dry land, largely paralleling the San Andreas Fault line. In San Francisco, a lot of San Francisco was still there, but it was not all intact. The principal part that survived was on the Rocky Promontory, which is in the downtown area. South of that, there was a lot of damage, but apparently the damage from the earthquakes and whatever else had hit started at a point someplace between San Francisco and San Jose, because the San Andreas Fault comes in at that point. San Jose, as I remember, was missing, and as you went further south, there was sort of a ragged loss of land. When it got down to Los Angeles, shall we say, the cliff area of the whole section on the beach from Malibu on south was missing. No cliffs, no apartment houses, no houses. The beaches were further inland, at least from what we thought they were originally. Downtown Los Angeles was essentially intact. It was built on a rocky area. The residential sections, other than the high hills of Altadena and some of the higher sections of Beverly Hills, were gone. They were just totally destroyed, and there was not that much left of Los Angeles as a functioning city. Long Beach, I don't recall whether it was still there or not, but I do recall that San Diego was totally gone because the loss of land began just slightly south of Los Angeles and went on inland on a rather ragged line, so that again approached the San Andreas Fault, which of course runs through the Salton Sea in the southern part of California on down into Mexico. That point, roughly from Laguna Beach or someplace a little north of it, on down to the Salton Sea, was all gone. It was underwater, the land was gone, and there were severe changes, shall we say, in that area. Nothing as severe as the Gordon Michael Scallion map, nowhere near as severe, because he showed most of California gone and most of Arizona gone, or greater parts of Nevada gone, none of that. But up north, there was severe damage in the Bay Area of Seattle. In Portland, I don't recall specifically whether that was still there or not. Chicago was gone. The Great Lakes were now one lake. Speaking, of course, and the Mississippi had undergone drastic changes. It had become a very wide waterway and an inland estuary at the narrowest point about 30 miles wide. As you went on south to New Orleans, the whole sand strip and the whole sand spit where New Orleans once was gone, as was the city of New Orleans. And then we found out that there was a swath of land about 50 miles wide across the entire Gulf area. the entire Gulf Coast, which was underwater. So this meant all of the coastal cities were gone. That included Houston. It included El Paso, Texas, Corpus Christi, Texas. They were all underwater and gone. Most of the Texas north of that 50-mile swath was still there. Dallas, as I recall, was still intact. But the Mississippi problem was enormous because when it got down to the Gulf, it wasn't 30 miles wide anymore. It was over 100. And there was an attempt made, apparently successful, to build a bridge across the narrowest point of the new Mississippi, which was 30 miles wide, and they did build what became the world's largest and longest suspension bridge across that point on the Mississippi that was still crossable. I asked other questions, like what about the East Coast? Well, the East Coast had some very strange changes. There was a large chunk of land missing from Georgia. Georgia was peculiarly hit in that the cities of Savannah were gone, the coastal cities were gone. Atlanta was still there, but 3 miles approximately from the ocean front. And the cutout of land was rather jagged, pointing towards Atlanta, but then went back towards the coast. And as you go on up the coast towards New York, the losses were very strange and they were sporadic and they were not on a continuous thing. It was a jagged outline. Baltimore and Washington were gone. New York City was still there, and what was left of it, which was mostly the section above the Battery on Manhattan Island. Because it's solid rock, it remained. And the areas like Brooklyn and Queens were essentially gone and replaced by water, and most of Long Island was intact. New England, there's some missing land areas, and as I said, Chicago was gone. Upstate New York had a very strange problem. The St. Lawrence River became an inland seaway and developed a lake which covered Albany, New York, a large saltwater lake. So there were a lot of strange changes in the United States. Canada, I did not pay any particular attention to. It didn't appear to have changed that much. Europe had drastic changes. In Europe, England was gone. Most, but not all, of Ireland was gone. The Highlands of Scotland was still alive and well, apparently. And in terms of the internal country and parts of Europe, as we know it now, quite a bit of it was underwater. Even parts of Switzerland were underwater. The mountains had dropped that far. What all had gone on in Europe, we don't really know. And the guys I asked the questions of couldn't really answer them correctly anyway, because they were not that familiar with it. The man I principally talked with was a hospital technician, quite intelligent, and during our stay there, he was the only black man we saw. He was a black medical technician, very competent and educated. He was the only black person we saw in our entire stay in the year 2137. But there was still rail travel, land travel. I didn't ask about airlines travel. And I happened to ask, what's the world population these days? And they said, slightly over 300, now down around 50 million or less. There was no government left acting on the face of the earth intact. They had all crumbled sometime between the period of 2000 and, as he told me, 2025. Martial law was set in almost all these areas. There was a combination of, and historically speaking, of a nuclear war, World War III, that was considered a rather brief World War III, but a lot of destruction, and then there was natural earth changes, which were more destructive than the war. Between all of those, there was a great loss of life, a loss of government, a loss of transportation, and of course with that you have starvation and other problems. And it went continually downhill from about 2003 is my guess, and he didn't specify a date. He said the records were hazy, but it looked like 2004 approximately, when things came apart. And at that point, he said what was left of the government under military control was attempting to rebuild the nation. And this was in 2137. He said it was well along to being rebuilt, but it was far from being completely rebuilt, and the destruction being replaced and over. So that was rather a strange interlude and rather a shock. Why we wound up there, I have no idea. It certainly was not our idea. And who, shall we say, engineered this little trip into the year 2137 is still unknown to me. I have some ideas as to who it might be, but that gets into a little later part of the dissertation and discussion of what happened. I asked about levels of science and technology. Oh yes, he said nothing was lost during this whole period of the earth destruction and the earth upheavals and the war. He said we still have computers, we have TV, we have all kinds of communications. I didn't ask him about space travel or what was going on in terms of what was once NASA. I didn't think to ask him about that because I was, shall we say, preoccupied with the otherwise earth changes and the total shift in the size of civilization and its structure. I asked about money and banks. He says, oh yes, there's still money. But he said the banks are a lot smaller than they were and they're not as active. And watching TV, now that I think about it, I didn't see a single ad about anything. So there was some major changes. Now, we stayed there approximately 6 weeks. I'm saying we, Duncan and myself. We did get up out of bed eventually and move around. But before the next phase began, I'll have to say that I thought we were stuck there, perhaps forever, without the slightest idea of how we got there in the first place, and they couldn't explain it either. We suddenly appeared someplace where they picked us up unconscious. We turned in to an ambulance crew, and they took us to a hospital. And we were in uniform, so they knew we were military personnel, but the military had changed drastically in the meantime, and the military at that era had no particular interest in us. One day, wandering around that hospital and hospital grounds, I disappeared from that era and from 2137, and I wound up in a still further future date. By what means, who arranged it, who provided the transportation, I don't know. It was obviously a form of time travel. The interesting thing about it was that Duncan was not with me. He remained behind at 2137, as I found out later. I wound up in the 28th century.